Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a mind-blowing historical investigation that traces a literally unbroken chain of forced labor in America. The core idea here? The mechanisms of forced agricultural labor in the U.S. didn't just vanish after the Civil War. Nope, they just evolved. We're going to see exactly how local poor farms, parish facilities like the Caddo P Farm, and massive state penitentiaries like Angola are all locked into one continuous historical loop.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll start with the 13th Amendment loophole, look at beta testing in poor farms, go inside the Caddo P Farm, scale up to Angola and convict leasing, and finally, bring it all together with the Louisiana loop thesis. Let's get into it.
Part 1, the 13th Amendment loophole. To really understand how this system survived, we've got to look at the legal foundation that made the whole thing possible. So check out the 13th Amendment. It has this massive, deliberate loophole, except as a punishment for crime. This little clause allowed states to systematically rebuild forced labor right through the criminal justice system. After child slavery was legally abolished, states, especially in places like Louisiana and Mississippi, went into overdrive. They strengthened vagrancy laws and pushed through the black codes. By legally lumping petty offenses, vagrancy, or literally just being unemployed in with serious criminality, they created this brand new, completely unfree labor force, perfectly tailored to fit that constitutional exception. And this is where the financial mechanics get truly chilling. Under the convict lease system, states weren't just saving money on housing and feeding people, they were actually generating revenue. They turned human beings back into profit-generating commodities. Private contractors paid the state for the labor and then worked these leased individuals to the bone on plantations, down in coal mines, and out in the sprawling lumber and turpentine camps of the Gulf Coast Pine Belt. Moving on to Part 2, beta testing with poor farms. Because before this turned into a massive state-level industrial operation, local counties and parishes were running their own grim little experiments. These local poor farms totally blurred the line between poverty and criminality. They were locking up absolutely destitute people right alongside folks who broke some minor vagrancy law. Imagine experiencing homelessness or temporary poverty, and suddenly you're housed in the exact same facility under the exact same forced labor expectations as someone convicted of a crime. Now look at who actually made up this labor force. You've got the elderly, the physically disabled, tramps, and debtors. But here is the real gut punch, the exploitation of youth. Driven entirely by economic motivations, local governments actively refused to build juvenile reform schools for Black youth. So what happened? These vulnerable children, and even orphans from local asylums, were funneled directly into poor farms. They were forced into brutal, physically demanding agricultural labor under this incredibly thin disguise of keeping them away from idleness. The poor farms simply extracted labor from the most vulnerable to keep itself self-sustaining. So what's the big takeaway here? These local sites were essentially the beta test. They proved that locking people up and forcing them to work the land was highly profitable, or at the very least, it heavily subsidized the local government. They wrote the bureaucratic blueprint for holding people against their will to work off so-called debts to society. All right, Section 3, inside the Caddo P Farm. Let's ground all of this in a highly specific, totally chilling micro-case study out of Shreveport, Louisiana. They called it the P Farm. Sounds folksy and harmless, right? Well, that mundane name masked a brutal reality. Created to be an entirely self-sustaining entity where inmates worked insane hours cultivating crops just to slash operational costs, the P Farm perfectly encapsulates that grim transition from the old poor farm model into a formalized, brutal parish prison farm. It relied heavily on extreme isolation, heavy labor, and essentially operated as an unmapped graveyard. To really grasp the immediate, visceral lethality of working the P Farm under the blazing southern sun, consider the story of J.C. Henderson from a 1933 inquest. Henderson was a 35-year-old Black man who arrived as a short-term prisoner. Just 3 days later, he was forced out into the July heat to work the fields with a hoe. He collapsed at 2:15 p.m. and died. The official cause of death? Sunstroke. And the horrifying part is, this wasn't some tragic anomaly. It was a built-in feature of the agricultural penal model. Which brings us to a really dark question. When people like J.C. Henderson literally dropped dead from exhaustion or violence, and their families couldn't afford to transport them, what did this bureaucratic machine do with the bodies? Well, the bureaucracy handled it with a kind of chilling efficiency. Investigators looking at official death certificates found that the penal system just seamlessly adopted the old poor farm tactic, erasing the dead. The state strictly filed the required paperwork listing the place of death as the penal farm, but the burial location routinely listed as just pauper's field. Bodies were buried in completely unmarked graves on the prison rounds. Any minimal markers just rotted away, leaving nothing but an empty field, completely erasing the human cost of the farm's so-called self-sufficiency. This leads us to part 4, Angola and convict leasing. Let's scale up from the local parish level and look at how this built into a massive state-level behemoth. 20%. Just sit with that number for a second. That was the annual mortality rate during the peak years of Samuel Lawrence James's convict leasing operations. By the 1880s, James controlled much of Louisiana's convict population, running massive enterprises on plantations, including the Angola property. The death rate from disease, brutal whippings, and pure exhaustion exceeded 20% a year. People were treated as completely expendable. If someone died, the state literally just provided a replacement. And then there's this deeply unsettling quote from the daughter of a prison captain at Angola in the 1940s. She said, "It was wonderful. I was the princess, and my daddy and my mother were the king and the queen, and we had servants." This totally exposes the often erased reality that incarcerated Black women were forced right into domestic servitude in the homes of prison officials. It highlights how the penal system recreated the antebellum social order down to the exact domestic details. The exploitation of Black women at Angola was absolute. They labored in the fields right alongside the men. They toiled in tobacco factories and canneries, and they did laundry for the entire penitentiary. Yet, while generating immense profit, they were also forced to raise the children of their captors, nursing white children while being ripped away from caring for their own. And incredibly, prison officials officially labeled all this domestic labor as non-productive, completely erasing their economic value on paper while heavily relying on it to survive every single day. Let's bring it all together in part 5, the Louisiana Loop Thesis. This is the climax of our explainer, showing how all these historical pieces, from poor farms to parish pea farms to massive plantations, lock together into one unbreakable circle. When you align the receipts across eras, the reality is just stunning. We are talking about the exact same geographic location, Angola, utilizing the exact same forced agricultural labor dynamics across 3 entirely different centuries. Whether it was chattel slavery in the 1850s, convict leasing in the 1900s, or the modern penal farm operating right now today, the core mechanism of extracting unfree labor from a captive demographic on that exact same soil remains completely identical. As the sources point out, the machine of forced labor never actually stopped running. It just got a software update. Slavery wasn't destroyed, the legal vocabulary just shifted. Suddenly they were inmates, trustees, and farms. The guards might use different equipment today, and different state departments might be in charge of oversight, but the machine itself relies on the exact same foundation of forced human labor. So why does all of this matter today? Well, it completely exposes the historical continuity in our modern systems. It reveals that the financial motivations to lock people up and extract their labor are not some new flaw, they are foundational. It highlights how the system continually erases the most vulnerable, from Black youth systematically denied reform schools, to women forced into domestic servitude, to men buried and forgotten in unmarked paupers' fields. The prison industrial complex we are debating today is operating on a perfectly preserved 19th century blueprint. I want to leave you with this one final provocative thought to wrap up this explainer. If the mechanism of forced labor literally never stopped running, what does that mean for justice today? As we look at the modern landscape of the criminal justice system, we really have to ask ourselves, how can we ever achieve true, meaningful reform if the foundation itself hasn't changed at all?